Well, this happened. It was a pretty famous director wanted to do a PSA for colon cancer, and he asked me if I'd be game for this, and I said, I would. And my doctor.
From the man who celebrated hard work to the one who quietly battled his own demons, this is the emotional story Mike Rowe never wanted the world to know. It begins in borrowed boots and Motel Dawn, in the thin blue before the crew knocks, when silence is a clean sheet and the day has not yet drawn its rough outline. He sits at the edge of a bed that remembers every back it has carried, laces pulled tight as a prayer, yesterday's mud crusted into a brittle shell. Most mornings, he stares at his hands for a second longer than he should. They look like they belong to two people at once, the man who became America's curious neighbor and the son who was taught that useful work does not always look the way the world expects. The camera would find him soon enough. It always did. It believed in him before he believed in himself. It said, "Show up, and the truth will do the rest." He answered most days by stepping into whatever job the day required. He took the shovel, the wrench, the hook, and the harness. He took the jokes too, because jokes were a way to carry weight that would otherwise seize the spine. He made a promise without saying it out loud. He would go wherever the work lived, and he would bring back proof that dignity prefers a plain coat. There was a rhythm to the show that nobody could fake. The workers taught it, the crew learned it, and Mike learned it all over again each time he put his shoulder under something heavy. He called it getting out of the way of ordinary greatness. Not the kind of greatness that needs medals or spotlight, but the kind that keeps towns from flooding, bridges from cracking, cattle from failing, engines from stalling, kitchens from closing, power from blinking out. He found poetry in places textbooks never mentioned. If a viewer laughed, fine. If a viewer gagged, also fine. If a viewer called their father to say thanks, that was the point. Fame was not the plan. He speaks about it now as if it were a gas leak, odorless, invisible, creeping through the vents while everyone else is asleep. The show grew from a segment into a season, then into a phenomenon. The calendar grew teeth. Airports replaced clocks. Hotels replaced street names. Meals replaced conversations. He learned how to sleep in 40-minute slices and how to perform gratitude when fatigue chewed the edges of his sentences. The machine of television likes winners who can work tired and smile on command. He did that longer than was healthy. There were days when the work punished him for trying to keep up. A slip on wet steel that rattled the bones. A misjudged step inside a tank where echo makes fools of careful feet. A winter morning on a lift, with wind that bit through every layer and left skin humming and numb. He told stories with humor, because humor is a kind of gauze you can pull across a wound until the bleeding slows. But the bruises added up. Even when they faded from purple to yellow to normal, the memory of them stayed bright. The crew joked that while the show cleaned the world, it dirtied the host. It was not a complaint, it was math. The letters kept coming, and each one was a weight he felt he needed to carry. Fathers watched with sons because their lives finally had a translator. Mothers pointed to the screen and said, "This is what your uncle does. This is why he comes home tired. This is why his laugh seems hard sometimes." Teachers pressed play in classrooms and waited for that moment when a student's face tilted toward the possibility that a trade might be a life, not a fallback. Mike read every letter he could. The ones that smelled like machine oil and worry hit him harder than the rest. He collected them the way some people collect stones from rivers. Small, smooth, significant. The tragedy did not come from a single blow. It came the way rust comes, patiently converting shine to dust at the margins while everyone is looking at the center. The production schedule was not a villain. It was a treadmill. You step on because stepping off feels like betrayal. The crew was family. The audience was a town that never stopped throwing a parade in your honor. The problem was not love. The problem was the math of hours versus body. He could not be in two places at once, but the calendar kept insisting that he try. A life at home began to resemble a set you strike and rebuild between scenes. You can live like that for a season, maybe two. You cannot live like that forever. Even his bank account proved complicated. People assume television means money that fixes everything. Television means bills and benefits, and yes, paychecks, but it also means a lot of other people who need to be paid. A machine that consumes cash the way a furnace consumes wood. He got by. He is candid about that. He did not starve. But there is a kind of poverty that has nothing to do with dollars. The kind where you cannot buy one more minute of sleep, one more day without a flight, one more week where your parents' voices are not coming through a speaker. That poverty he felt, no matter what the ledger said. He was not alone. People behind the camera wake up with the same aches. The gaffer who lifted more than anyone else, the field producer who learned to run toward the sound of a problem, the sound engineer who stopped hearing some frequencies and pretended it was fine. They saw the country together through the windshield of vans that carried a mountain of equipment and an ocean of coffee. They were not martyrs, they were professionals, but professionals break too. Some did quietly, and then came back after the bones knit. Some did loudly, and never returned. He kept a list of names in his head. When he spoke of them later, his voice lowered without his permission. The first ending arrived with a note of gratitude and a pause that lasted longer than anybody planned. The country had changed. The industry had changed. He had changed. He said thank you, sincerely, and he meant it. He also meant something else he did not say out loud. A man cannot be a mascot for work and fail to do his own work of self-preservation. That would be a pretty lie, and his show had trained him to avoid pretty lies. He walked toward the exit with a rueful smile and a goodbye that felt unfinished because closures rarely stitch cleanly on the first try. What you did not see on TV was the reckoning that followed. When a machine stops, the silence feels large and unfurnished. He found himself with mornings that did not begin with call sheets. He found his feet wandering toward familiar habits, writing, speaking, listening on purpose. He looked for the thread he had dropped somewhere between the septic tank and the shipyard. It was there, under the noise. It was always there. A simple belief. That work is not a prop. Work is a story we tell with our hands. If you tell it honestly, people can hear themselves in it. To get back to that belief, he turned down opportunities that would have kept him busy and visible and numb. He said no to ideas that would have sanded off the roughness of the people he loved to feature. He said yes to ideas that could breathe. He built things you cannot film in a day. A scholarship that followed a welder from application to apprenticeship to payday. A conversation about the skilled trades that refused to perform outrage and instead offered facts and faces. A note to a school board that read like a neighbor knocking on your door with a casserole and a suggestion. During that quieter season, something broke in a way that cannot be fixed by sleep or a new contract. His father's health faltered. The man who had taught him to believe in the dignity of ordinary things took a hit that clipped the family close. He wrote about it with a tenderness that surprised even his friends, and strangers felt they had been invited, gently, to sit in the back pew and keep their hats in their hands. Grief walks through a family slowly, touching every surface. It makes a museum of your childhood. He held that grief with the same respect he gave to the smell of diesel, and fertilizer, and pigs, and brine. It was a part of life he could not joke around. He didn't try. He told the truth. He lost his father, and with that loss, the quiet got heavier and more holy. He learned that even the strongest men cannot angle their shoulders and carry certain things alone. He learned to ask for help and to accept it. With grief came clarity. You can rehearse priorities your whole life, or you can hold them, heavy and warm, like a sleeping grandchild. He chose to hold them. He would still work. He is a worker by nature. But the form would change. He wanted projects that told stories without shrinking them. He wanted time to sit in a welding booth and not narrate every spark. Time to stand in a classroom and let a teenager's question stretch out without cutting it into a soundbite. He wanted to be a son who called his mother, not a persona who saved his voice for the microphone. A man can want those things after the age of 50. A man can claim them. He did. Meanwhile, the country kept living the story he had been telling, that we are held together by people whose jobs make for ugly hands and satisfied hearts. The lights came on because somebody climbed in the dark. The drain clears because somebody crawled in the stink. The road holds because somebody poured and smoothed while the rest of us slept. He kept finding ways to name that truth. Sometimes it took the shape of a small show with a small crew and a large heart. Sometimes it took the shape of a speech in a factory where the machines paused so the people could listen. Sometimes it took the shape of a podcast recorded in a room with no windows and a table that remembered every elbow that had leaned on it. He carried the old bruises into this new work, not as trophies, but as maps. This scar from the time the rebar fought back. This ache from the week he thought 2 hours of sleep was plenty because the schedule said so. This stiffness from 10 years of saying yes to every request that sounded noble. He began to treat his body like a colleague instead of a rival. He began to hear the whisper of fatigue as a language worth learning. He began to understand that the camera's appetite is infinite, but a life's is not. The heartbreaking part, if you want to name it cleanly, is simple. He built a bridge between the people who work in the dark and the people who live in the light. He walked that bridge so many times, he forgot that a body can only do so much crossing without rest. The show that made him a symbol took a tax he did not calculate correctly until it came due. It cost him years that could have been gentler, bones that could have been quieter, holidays that could have been longer. It cost him the illusion that he could carry every story and make every flight and answer every letter. It taught him that being useful sometimes means being absent, and that is a hard lesson to learn on a stage. He is not angry about the bill. He pays it with gratitude. He says, "I got to go where most people never go, and I got to learn from people who have never been asked to teach." He says, "The smell of the world is not a problem to be solved. It is a chorus to be respected." He says, "Failure came in handy because it taught him when to ask for another pair of hands." He says, "Hero is a word that belongs to paramedics and welders and farmers and nurses before it belongs to anyone whose face appears on a screen." There is another kind of heartbreak, the soft kind that sneaks up on you when you realize how fame rearranges a family's furniture. The parents who used to watch you from a folding chair at the back of a school auditorium now watch you on a hotel TV where the colors look a little too loud. They become characters in your story before you can grab the pen back. They carry your mail because you are on a plane. They take a picture with a stranger because you are tired, and they are kind. When illness came knocking, the public found out because the public had been invited for so long. He made the choice to share because he had always shared. He would make that choice again, but not without naming the cost. It takes something to be open for that long. In the middle of all this, he also remembered what it was like to be an apprentice to joy. There are moments that did not fit in the show because they were not jobs. They were pauses that smelled like coffee, or hay, or rain on hot asphalt. A crew member's baby fell asleep on a sound blanket, while somebody rigged a light with one hand and rocked the stroller with the other. A welder's laugh after a spark jumped and singed an eyebrow just enough to become a story. A long drive where nobody spoke and nobody needed to. He gathered those moments like pocket change and spent them later when the day demanded more than he had. The work itself kept evolving. After the first exit, the silhouette of the show appeared again in the distance, different but familiar. A reunion of sorts, a road trip that looked backward and forward at once. A return that allowed him to draw a line between the past and the present without breaking either. He took that chance on his terms. Fewer flyers, more reflection, less sprinting, more walking through the same doorway twice to see what details he had missed the first time. He learned that a person can revisit the scene of a former life without moving back in. He learned that nostalgia is sweeter when it does not hide the blisters. When he stepped back in front of the lens, it was not because he needed the applause. He frankly did not. It was because there were still corners of the country that deserved to be seen with patience. The jobs had not stopped being dirty. The people had not stopped being proud. The culture had not stopped misunderstanding both. He returned like a neighbor who found a spare key in the flower pot and let himself in long enough to make sure the pipes had not burst. He watered the plants of a story that had fed him. Then he locked up and left the house tidy. It is tempting to turn him into a parable about work-life balance, but that would be too tidy for a man who made a living inside a mess. He does not offer formulas. He offers scenes. A night in a motel with thin walls and a phone call with his mother that ran long because there was nothing more urgent than the sound of her voice. A morning on a scaffold with a fear that climbed as fast as his feet and a joke that cut it down to size. An afternoon filling out a scholarship check for a kid whose parents never heard their own work praised in public. A twilight on a stage where he said, "Thank you to a town that smells like salt and diesel and pride." He is older now. He says so without apology and with a grin that admits he once thought older meant someone else. The boots still fit, but he does not tie them for the sake of a camera anymore. He ties them when the job is necessary, and he unties them when the work is calling from another room. A page that needs a paragraph, a friend who needs a visit, a promise that needs to be kept without witnesses. He has learned to let a day be a day instead of a performance. He has learned that some of the most important work leaves no footage, only faces that look steadier for having been seen. The tragedy of Mike Rowe is not that the world saw him do hard things. The tragedy is that for a stretch of years, the world mistook his willingness to be everywhere for his ability to be invulnerable. He was never invulnerable. He was always a man in a pair of boots that did not belong to him until he wore them into a shape that fit. He was always someone's son. He is still someone's son, even now that a chair at the table sits empty and the stories are told in a tense that does not feel natural yet. He moves through that new grammar with care. He chooses his words the way a carpenter chooses screws. He knows which ones hold, which ones split the wood, which ones squeak later. Listen closely, and you can hear the cadence that made a show into a compass. It is a plain song, learned from fathers and mothers and strangers in uniforms, learned from men who love their hands because they have earned the right to call them tools. It says, "The country is not an idea in a book. It is a set of tasks performed daily by people who would do them even if nobody were filming." It says, "You can love a job and still let it go when it starts taking more than it gives." It says, "There are seasons for sweating and seasons for sitting with the people who taught you how to sweat." He looks back with a softness that is not regretful. He still laughs about the days when the smell in the truck was a character unto itself. He still remembers the names of dogs in shops where dogs are better co-workers than some people he has met. He still writes down phrases he hears in the wild. A welder who calls a beautiful bead a necklace. A plumber who calls a stubborn clog a sermon. A farmer who calls a good rain a handshake from God. He hoards those phrases the way other men hoard spare parts. You never know when a sentence will fix a problem you didn't even realize you had. He looks forward with a steadiness that does not need reverb. There are projects that will ask him to lift again. He will lift. There are projects that will ask him to listen. He will listen. There are projects that will ask him to vanish so someone else can stand in the circle of light. He is getting better at that too. He knows that legacy is a tricky word that tries to make a monument out of a man who would rather make a phone call. He knows that if he leaves an impression, he would like it to be on a check that puts a kid into a classroom where sparks fly and nobody flinches. If you want a neat moral, you will not get one. You will get a set of coordinates. Start where you are. Respect the people who keep you warm, fed, safe, moving. Tell the truth about what it costs to do that work day after day. Rest when you can. Laugh when the barn cat knocks over the bucket and the milk goes everywhere and the apprentice curses in a language they just learned. Call your mother. Wear ear protection. Do not pretend that pain is a myth. Do not pretend that quitting is the same thing as stopping. You can step away from a camera and still be visible to the people who matter. Maybe in the end, the heartbreak lives in a single detail. Somewhere on a shelf sits a pair of boots that have seen more of this country than most citizens ever will. The laces are frayed at the ends where patience has been tied and untied 1,000 times. The soles remember ladders and catwalks and wet concrete and the aluminum of boat decks before dawn. Those boots are not a trophy. They are a record. They testify that work and love are not separate categories. They testify that a man can be both host and son, both storyteller and story, both worker and witness, both public and private, both tired and grateful. The cameras will always find someone else to love. That is their nature. They hunger and move on. What remains is quieter and closer. A chair next to a parent. A classroom where a kid learns the shape of a weld. A shop floor where a joke loops for 10 years and never gets old. A kitchen table where a check is signed with a hand that shakes a little because the work of giving is its own kind of labor. A grave visited with flowers and silence. A morning without a call time where the first voice you hear is your own, saying, "Today we will do one thing well, and then we will stop." What happened to Mike Rowe is not a mystery. It is the oldest story in the repertoire. A man chased purpose, found a stage, wore himself thin, performing a truth the stage could not contain, and then stepped off to keep that truth intact. He paid a price most of us do not see until it is itemized by pain and absence. He absorbed that reckoning with humility, recalibrated his days, and kept right on honoring the work that built him. The heartbreak is real. So is the beauty that grew where the spotlight used to stand. He would probably tell you it is not about him. He would roll his eyes and gesture toward a plumber in Minnesota, a mason in Georgia, a dairy farmer in Wisconsin, a tugboat fitter in Alabama, a rod buster along an overpass where rebar makes a chorus 1,000 hands can sing. He would point out that television does not build anything. People do. He would grin and admit that television can tell a good story, though, when it remembers who the main characters are. And maybe if the mood is right, he would add that sometimes the most honest work a man can do is to rest, to grieve, to love, to keep showing up in the places where there are no credits at the end. He kept finding himself in rooms where the air was thick with stories that never make headlines. A welding lab humming with heat and hope. A union hall where retirees carry decades like a well-folded flag. A high school shop where a kid with quick hands catches his breath when a bead finally lays smooth. He talked less than he used to, and he listened more. The old impulse to narrate still stirred, but he let silence do some of the teaching. When the camera called again, He did not sprint to answer. He walked, he asked better questions of the people who held the clipboard, and he asked the best questions of himself. Can we show the work without turning it into spectacle? Can we leave in the rough edges that prove this country is built by hands that do not polish themselves for the sake of a close-up? Can we remember that danger is not a punchline? The set agreed because the audience had grown up too. They could tell the difference between a stunt and a life. There were reunions, the gentle kind that let you touch what you used to be without pretending you never left it. He drove on old roads and visited old shops. The crew looked older, and so did he, which felt like honesty wearing a familiar coat. They laughed about scenes the audience remembers, and they honored scenes the audience never saw, like the time a rigger caught a falling light with both hands and a prayer. They spoke names that now belong to memory. Then they took a long moment and let the room do what rooms do when love sits down beside it. He kept his promise to the people who wrote letters from places that smell like work. More scholarships found their way into the world, checks written with a careful hand that had spent years holding ropes and railings. He answered messages with the patience he had learned from men who measure twice and cut once. He showed up in small towns with a small crew and a large respect for the way a diner opens at 5 because someone was there at 4. He used the light to reach into corners, not to blind. The heartbreak had not vanished. It simply changed shapes. Some nights the ache was literal, joints that remembered ladders and cold metal. Other nights the ache was the unsteady quiet that follows a life lived at volume. He called this honesty, and he let people hear it. He said that mental health is not a slogan. It is a set of practices, small and ordinary, like taking a walk, like telling the truth about how tired you are, like admitting that laughter and sorrow often share the same bench. He watched the culture argue about what counts as real work. Then he stepped in where the arguing got loud and unproductive. He did not scold. He introduced people, a lineman to a lawyer, a nurse to a city planner, a farmer to a teenager who had never been outside the glow of his phone for longer than an hour. He made a space where gratitude could move between strangers and keep moving after the lights went down. He came to believe that influence is often nothing more than a well-timed introduction. On some sets, he seated the center on purpose. He stood off to the side and pointed the camera toward a woman whose life had gone unnoticed for 20 years of night shifts. He gave the mic to a man who had never spoken into one, then waited while nerves settled and courage rose. He learned that a good host is not the story. A good host makes sure the story does not get lost in the gear. This felt like a correction and a calling at once. He slept better on those nights. There were critics who wanted a grand return, a headline that would make the years click neatly into place. He understood the hunger and forgave it. Still, he refused the narrative that said value equals visibility. He was done measuring worth by the number of eyes on a scene. The better metric, he decided, was the number of lives that felt seen because of a scene. That math solved for a different unknown, one that let him get up in the morning and put on his boots without bargaining with himself. The myth of invulnerability, that old costume, did not fit anymore. He took it off gently and folded it like a jacket he might need on some future day, though he doubted it. In its place, he wore something kinder, a harder truth carried more softly. He admitted that the work had taken a toll. He admitted that he had not attended every birthday or every quiet crisis. He admitted he had learned the hard way the difference between sacrifice and self-cancellation. He spoke these sentences as if each were a fragile container, and he did not spill them. He also admitted that the joy was real, that it is still real, that the sound of a shop waking up will always be one of his favorite sounds in the world. He admitted that he still loves the smell of salt on a dock and the first heat off a furnace and the moment a stubborn machine decides to behave. He admitted that he still chases laughter like a good dog, because laughter saved whole days that would have broken without it. He let this joy stand beside the grief, so the story would not lean too hard to one side. In the end, the tragic part of his story is not a fall from grace, or a scandal whispered about in green rooms. The tragic part is quieter. It is the realization that a life can be devoured by its own success if you do not notice what is being eaten. He noticed. Late, maybe, but in time to rescue what mattered most. He set boundaries that felt like fences, and later revealed themselves as gardens. He brought his mother flowers and did not turn the moment into a lesson. He sat with friends who had carried him when he did not know he needed carrying, and he did not film it. And so the work continues, just not in the same shape. He walks into shops where the owners think no one notices them, and he notices them. He sits in the back rows and listens for the line that will become a sentence someone else needs to hear. He puts on gloves when they are required, and he takes them off when a handshake asks for skin. He has learned to leave rooms before the applause becomes an addiction. He has learned to arrive before the fear becomes a habit. He has learned to be visible without being consumed. If you listen closely, you will hear an old promise made new. Respect the people who keep the lights on. Respect the people who clean the messes. The rest of us pretend do not exist. Respect the people who build the things that hold us up and hold us together. Tell their stories if you can, but do not confuse the telling for the doing. Say thank you where it counts, in paychecks, in policies, and in the daily grammar of how we treat one another. As for him, the boots are still by the door. Some mornings he wears them into places the country never sees. Some evenings he leaves them there and walks barefoot across a floor that smells like lemon oil and quiet. He has learned to let the day be ordinary without apology. He has learned that the truest measure of a career is the people who are steadier because you were there for a while. He has learned that even a heartbreak can become a kind of light if you stand it in the window and let it be seen. Hit that subscribe button if you believe every story, especially the painful ones, deserves to be told with honesty, empathy, and respect for the people who inspired us all.